Okay, so my job was to talk a little bit about what we know about the effects of marijuana on health. And so obviously I can't do this justice in 30 minutes. So I thought I'd give you just a little bit of background and a couple of examples. First of all, as I'm sure you all know, the marijuana plant or cannabis plant contains a number of compounds that are related to the cannabinoid family. So there are about 70 cannabinoids in marijuana. THC is probably the one that you've heard about, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. We're going to call it THC for short. And there's another compound that I'm going to talk about a little bit called cannabidiol. And I've abbreviated this as CBD. You will, now that you've seen this today, probably as you read things, whether it's the lay press, whether it's on the web, whether it's in the literature, you're going to recognize CBD as well. Okay, so THC. The reason that people smoke marijuana is because of the THC. The THC makes most people feel good. And I'm sure it's no surprise to you, not only does it give them a sense of pleasure and euphoria, it is relaxing. There are many people that claim that it provides analgesia to alleviate their pain. I must put a caveat there that that level of pain relief is only produced at intoxicating doses. You have to be stoned in order to feel that kind of pain alleviation, which, by the way, happens to be true for alcohol. And I'm sure that you all know that the munchies side of the effects of marijuana does produce hunger, and of course, that can be exploited for therapeutic reasons. Now, not all people feel good when they smoke marijuana. There is a significant but small proportion of people that don't feel so good when they smoke marijuana. And of course, those are most of the people that don't tend to do it again. But they can become anxious. They can have altered sensory perceptions, time distortion. Sometimes you'll see the word dysphoria, which is kind of the opposite of euphoria. It makes them feel bad. They can be disoriented to time and space as well. So I want you to remember this because we're going to come back to this a little bit later. But like all drugs, not everyone responds in the same way. So we have kind of, I think of the bell-shaped curve for just about everything, the normal curve. And you have most people in the middle somewhere, and then you have those people that live in the tails. And they have perhaps heightened responses or very minimal responses to that drug. So now that you know some of the active compounds in marijuana, let's just talk a little bit briefly how it works. So this is a wonderful photomicrograph drawing by Graham Johnson, who won an award from the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for his drawings and biology. This is, if you haven't figured it out, a neuron in the brain. And the way, in order for us to talk about how marijuana works, we have to know a little bit about how the brain works. So neurons, they talk to each other. They communicate with electrical and chemical signals. And I'm just going to show you that the direction of that communication is to the right. Okay? So there's electrical signals that come down this long tube, which we call an axon. Maybe you remember that from high school biology way back when. And when it hits the terminal, the end of that neuron, a whole bunch of magic happens. All the chemicals that are inside that terminal come out into the space here, the little space if you can see it. And those chemicals bind to receptors or proteins on the receiving side of another neuron. And so that electrical and chemical communication is what makes our brains work. It also is what makes your heart beat and your muscles contract. It's all the same thing. So that's normal. Now, to understand how marijuana, or the THC, for example, in marijuana, how it works, it binds to a target. And that target is a receptor, and I've actually drawn it here for you, sitting in a little biological membrane. That membrane is the membrane of the neuron that I just showed you. Okay? And these little sort of, and it's kind of like rigatoni looking pieces of pasta. Believe it or not, that is the real structure of this receptor, this protein. And we got that structure from very special X-ray crystallography studies where they can tell exactly how the atoms line up and the molecules line up in that protein. And so what happens is THC, which are the little green balls, comes along and it binds. It is attracted to that protein, this receptor. And when it binds, it kicks off a series of events in this cell, which happens to be a neuron, to do something. It could be to make some more electrical impulses. It could be to kick off a bunch of enzymes to do something. It could be to make some instructions to the DNA, to the gene, to change the way the genes are working. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But so all kinds of things can happen when these little THC balls bind to the cannabinoid receptor. Now, I want to just back up 1 second because you just heard me say genes and proteins. So we're going back to biology 101. Just want to remind you where the proteins come from. So think about, you've got a cell and a nucleus, and inside the nucleus, of course, are your chromosomes. And the chromosomes, of course, are all coiled up, long pieces of DNA. And those long pieces of DNA are coiled up because it's so long, it wouldn't fit inside your cell nucleus unless you rolled it up into little balls, into a chromosome. But pieces of the DNA along the way are the genes. So those big spans of the DNA are the genes. And those genes basically are the regulators of the instructions to make your proteins. So all this information in your genes, in the DNA, are driving the instructions to make a protein. So here I've just drawn on this particular chromosome, there is a gene for the cannabinoid receptor, CB1. Okay, and that gene makes the instructions, sends the instructions for your cell to make the cannabinoid receptor. And then, of course, once it makes it, it has to get to where it needs to live on your cell membranes. All right, so let's put them on the cell membranes. Here's where most of them live, in the brain, right here on the terminal of that sending neuron. And those receptors, by sitting there, normally respond to those endogenous compounds that Dr. Friedman talked about, the endocannabinoids. So, okay, our information is going this way, and our cannabinoid receptors are sitting there, and they are going to do something when they see, or when the THC binds to them. When the THC binds to these receptors, it blocks the release of the chemicals in this neuron, and so now the communication is disrupted between these two neurons. Okay, so it's doing something specific to the way the neurons are actually working. And if you haven't figured it out already, the fact that the name of that receptor had a 1 meant that there was probably a 2. And I suspect as time goes on, we will find there's probably a 3 and maybe even a 4. And as the research is blossoming, we find out more and more about this. Well, what we've found out so far is most of the CB1 receptors are on neurons, the way I just showed you. And most of the CB2 receptors are on our immune cells. And the latest research has shown that there's a subset of these CB2 receptors that are predominantly in the testis as well as in the brain. It's a small percentage, and 5 years ago we didn't know whether they were there, but we know that they are there now. So there's a lot of very interesting information coming out and a lot of study as to what are they doing there and why, what kinds of functions are they mediating. So I put here just a little list for you to reiterate what I've already mentioned about what we know with THC and its interactions with CB1 receptors. Obviously, it affects mood, cognition. Dr. Friedman talked about that. Appetite. Even nausea is related to its actions, or treating nausea, for example. And the CB2 receptor is, from much of the more recent research that's been done, now shown to be very important in participation of immune cell migration, which may explain a lot of the kind of immunosuppressive qualities of marijuana. Inflammation as well. The CB2 receptors are located on cells of the immune system that participate in inflammatory responses. And then also on much of the newer research, the CB2 actions of cannabinoids can be shown to affect fertility in both men and women, and mood. And I put the question mark here with mood because this is part of the really newer research that's coming out now. There's a lot of intense interest on this particular target with respect to how cannabinoids may be affecting mood. And I'm going to bring that back in a few minutes when we talk about mental illnesses that are mood disorders. So you probably know the answer to this question. Why are those receptors even there? And Dr. Friedman mentioned it, I mentioned it a minute ago, but they're there because we have in our own cells, not just our neurons, by the way, but many cells in our body, are endogenous cannabinoids. They don't have anything to do with THC. They've just been named that way by scientists, okay? There's nothing similar about the structure other than all these carbons, and you probably don't remember your high school chemistry, but lots of carbons means it has a fatty character to it, very lipid-like, okay? And these compounds are released from the receiving neuron on demand. When you need to think about something or you need to be involved with some planning of something, and Dr. Friedman talked about a number of things that the prefrontal cortex is involved in, on demand, when you need these endocannabinoids to help those neurons function, they are released from this neuron and they go backwards. So my arrow is backwards. They go the other way from that level of communication I was telling you was to the right, okay? They go backwards, they bind to the cannabinoid receptor, and they modulate how that neuron's going to release its neurotransmitters. And that's what keeps us all working normally, doing things that we're supposed to do. The problem is when you come along with a bunch of those big green balls, the THC, and you mess this whole thing up, okay? Now this exquisitely controlled process is really thrown for a loop. And you can imagine that that can do different things to different people. There are lots of variables involved in how different people are going to respond to that. Okay, so depending on where those receptors are in the brain, that will provide a basis for what the THC will do. So for example, the receptors that are here in the back, the visual cortex of your brain, those receptors, when they are bound by THC, will be responsible for the altered visual perception. Memory impairment here in the frontal part of the brain that Dr. Friedman talked about, as well as the hippocampus. It's kind of in the middle of your brain, the center of your memory and learning. Lots of receptors there. I think Dr. Friedman actually showed you a nice picture of that. Here's the part of the hypothalamus, your feeding center, and right in the sort of the bottom, in the middle of the brain, that little purple area. And of course, I've drawn in pink here the areas that Dr. Friedman showed you in the reward circuit that are responsible for the, what I could use as an umbrella term of the addiction, but the drug-seeking behavior and the drive, the motivation to want to use the drug. So there are a number of places throughout the brain just to depict for you. Depends on where the receptors are as to what the drug will do. Now, we can actually see these receptors with really cool imaging techniques in people, in live people. So these are PET scans where we can actually look for the receptors. And the actual images have been color-coded, kind of the way, you know, on the weather reports, they color-code the satellite images with the blue and the red. And so they're color-coded here. So the blue are the lowest level of cannabinoid receptors, and the red are the highest level of cannabinoid receptors. And what you're looking at on the left is a bird's eye view of the brain. In the middle is a side view like this. So it's as if I took a slice right through like this, and you could peer right inside. And on the right, it's a frontal view looking this way. And I'm sure, using Dr. McClellan's terminology, it doesn't take a scientist to see, or it does take a scientist to see, that there are more receptors in that frontal part of the brain and in the cortex, but you can see they're all over the brain, okay? Now, what's interesting is there's been some neat studies that have been done. And by the way, I just want to let you know that I'm going to show you a lot of data from different studies, and I've tried to limit all my studies to within 3 or 4 years old. So this is all really new stuff. And I have to tell you, this is what my opinion, not fact, that I think scientists are 15 to 20 years ahead of the rest of the public in terms of what we know. I wish it could be less than that. But we know so much, and generally the public is totally unaware of this. There are always exceptions. So in this particular study that was published a couple of years ago, what they looked at were these PET scans for cannabinoid receptors in 2 groups of people. And these 2 groups of people, the ones on the top, are people that they did a bunch of cognitive testing on and found them to be low novelty seekers. Probably someone like me, okay? And on the bottom, these were high novelty seekers. These are people that were going to go out and do these bungee jumping and jumping out of airplanes and doing other highly risky behaviors. Turns out that these people down below are also at very high risk for substance abuse, alcohol dependence, etc. And what do you see? These people have lower levels of cannabinoid receptors in their brain. So it raises a very interesting question. Were they born that way? Are people with lower levels of cannabinoid receptors and high risk takers born that way, and therefore they go out and they do these things because they're missing something that the rest of us have that's making us work normally, if you want to call that normal? So that's an interesting idea. And that's possible, that could be. But there are other studies that show the opposite. So this is a study, a small study actually, in which they looked at heavy marijuana users, and they came into the hospital for this imaging, and they imaged the same way their cannabinoid receptors, and then they stopped smoking. So they went for 4 weeks with no pot. And then they re-imaged them. And the yellow shows the recovery of their cannabinoid receptors after the 4 weeks. And not only that, so obviously they weren't born with lower levels of receptors. Their smoking made their receptors go down. And when they stopped smoking, they started to recover. And the other nice thing that they showed was what we pharmacologists call a dose response. The longer and more they smoked, the lower they went. So it's probably both, partly what we're born with and partly what we do in our environment to change that. Now what about this other compound, cannabidiol, that I told you at the beginning? This is kind of interesting. So again, to reiterate some of the effects of THC that I've already talked about, the interesting thing about this other compound is that not only doesn't it produce euphoria, but it can block the euphoria that's produced by THC. And not only doesn't it produce anxiety, it can be anti-anxiety, or an anxiolytic compound. It can also be an antipsychotic compound. These are all based on what they've shown in animal models, very, very good models for human behavior, and also from some studies on humans where they just give them the CBD, they inject the CBD, you don't have to smoke it or anything. You can tease these apart. Who's interested in THC? Recreational users. Who's interested in CBD? Anybody? Medical marijuana? Even better than that. Drug companies, that's who's interested in CBD. In fact, oh, and of course, no cognitive impairment. That's great, right? Wouldn't you say? In fact, CBD is a drug developer's dream. Not only does it do the things in the list, but you can see in the pie chart here, it prevents tumor growth, it prevents tumor metastasis, it's an antidepressant, it's neuroprotective if you have a stroke, it's anti-inflammatory. Wow, I want that. That's great. Actually, I have to tell you, as a pharmacologist, I know of no drug that can do all these things. So I look at some of this with a little bit of skepticism. We will find out in several years, because there are major drug companies that have opened up whole divisions now for CBD drug development. This is a very major area going on at the moment, which is kind of interesting because they've run out of ideas for all the traditional drugs. Now, why am I telling you this about the CBD? So it's some very interesting work that was done actually about 2 years ago. So some folks from the Rand Corporation, and they looked at the ratio of THC to CBD in pot that was seized in different places along the border of Mexico and California, and then they looked at the seizures of pot from different places as you went up the coast of California. And what you can see is that in 1996, the THC to CBD ratio in the pot that was seized, whether it was at the border with Mexico, meaning the pot came from Mexico, right? Or whether it was seized at other places more north, away from Mexico, it was about 10 to 1, 5 to 10 to 1. Now remember, the THC is what you want if you want to get high. You don't want the CBD unless you're a drug development company. And over the years, they kept looking at these seizures. And what they found was that pretty much over the years, the Mexican pot has pretty much the same ratio of THC to CBD. But as they went north and looked at the other sites in California, farther away from the border, where the people who are using pot are growing their own, they've genetically engineered the plants to get rid of the CBD. and elevate the THC. And so now it's running close to over 200 to 1. So in the discussion later, when talking about people having the ability to grow their own, there's way more to that than just growing your own. What they've done is engineered out of the plant the protective cannabinoid to boost the one that's got the more cognitive dysfunctional effects. And just to also address the whole issue of advertisement, the advertisement thing, you know, the web is going to overtake all of that anyway. You just look on the web, what's advertised. This is a typical advertisement on the web for the highest yield medical marijuana that has maximum THC. Well, really, medical marijuana would be not the THC, it would be the CBD. But they don't want the public to know that. By the way, the people, I think, that were all for the genetic engineering are the same people that are protesting against genetic engineering of other things. It's okay if it's, you know, for something I want. Now, there is a drug on the market in other countries. It's an oral spray that may be approved by FDA at the end of this year that has a THC to CBD ratio of 1:1. It's called Sativex. It's approved in other countries for intractable cancer pain and spasticity for multiple sclerosis. So this may be out by next year here in the US. This does not have the dysphoric effects of THC because the THC ratio is very low. Okay, so in terms of this background now, what kinds of health problems can we talk about? I want to give you several caveats and I want to talk about 4 body parts. And these are things you can take home just to think about, but I want you to understand that it's very difficult to prove causation in humans. We are just not the perfect model for doing that. We have animal models that can be very, very useful for studying causation, but then we have to step back and say, can we show this kind of phenomenon in human populations? Association or correlation is not causation. Oftentimes that is confused in the lay press. So if you should read studies, you need to be mindful of that. Failure to see an effect doesn't prove that it isn't there. So there are many, many reasons why we don't see something. It could be the way the study was done. It could be some confounding factor. And that's why we do need duplication in experiments and in studies to show that maybe someone missed something or they may have done it incorrectly. Also, many marijuana users use tobacco and alcohol as well, and that can confound some of the results. Now, oftentimes studies will actually try and control for that, and so there are many good studies that can do that. It's not perfect, but oftentimes we can tease apart what's due to the marijuana or marijuana plus tobacco or plus alcohol. By the way, most marijuana users also drink alcohol while they use. And the best studies include these longitudinal time points over time, long periods of time, varied doses and frequencies, as well as the right control. So those are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about when you look at studies in making your policy decisions as you go down the road. There's not a whole lot known about the cardiovascular system. I just put it in here because I want you to know that there are effects, acute effects on heart rate and blood pressure, and marijuana does make the heart work harder. When you make the heart work harder, depending on your underlying genetics, it can produce things like heart attacks and stroke. In fact, there was a recent study a few years ago, very small, in which they looked at 48 stroke patients who came into the hospital. These were all relatively young. People under age 45 don't usually have strokes. But of those 45 people, 11 had a certain kind of stroke called a multifocal, we'll call it MIS for short. Many different vessels were constricted in their brains to cause the stroke. Of those 11 people, 10 of them had used cannabis, as well as tobacco. So they did not control for tobacco in this study for several months or years prior to the stroke, although they had all binged on marijuana within 5 days before the stroke. What's really cool about this study is they actually had images of the stroke before and after it happened in one of their individuals. And on the left this is a 19-year-old that came in to the hospital. These are the main arteries in the back of the brain. Was imaged because in his family there was some history of aneurysms and they wanted to image him just to make sure everything was okay. Everything was okay. At age 20, he started smoking marijuana. At age 21, he came into the hospital with these really awful, severe headaches. And sure enough, when they imaged him, he was having a stroke. And the stroke you can see by the red arrows here with the constriction of those vessels, those arteries. He went off the marijuana, stopped smoking. 3 months later, they re-imaged all the patients after the strokes and found that there was recovery of those vessels. They did not see recovery in the patients who did not stop smoking. They stayed constricted. Another body part, I'm just going to tell you, testicles. You've got all this in your notes, so if you want to go through later, there are cannabinoid receptors on the testes and in sperm. And the biggest sort of news about this in the latest studies, 3 major studies in the United States, all showing the same thing. A certain type of testicular cancer, there's a heightened risk depending on which study was done. They all agree about a 2-fold risk of this certain type of testicular cancer, which strikes younger men. It has the lowest survival rate. It's the one you don't want. That risk is elevated if they started at younger than age 18 with smoking, and if they smoke, for example, longer than 10 years. But I have actually given you all the references for every one of these studies, so if you'd like to look them up, you can. They're on your last slide. Lungs, it's not surprising, certainly risk of bronchitis and respiratory infections. For heavy users, heavy smokers, the lung cancer risk is elevated considerably. And you've heard much about the brain already. I will just throw out a few tidbits that cannabis use disorder, which is what Dr. McClellan talked about as one of the substance use disorders, 12 to 18-year-olds are 3 to 7 times as likely to have this disorder than older young adults. And by the way, this disorder is twice as high in states with medical marijuana. Anxiety and mood disorders, again, for young people using occasionally, weekly, or daily over 15 years, they are 2.5 more times likely to have an anxiety disorder by the age of 29. And if they're not using at age 29, they're still twice as likely to have an anxiety disorder, indicating there's something that's changed and that may not be reversed. You've seen this slide already with the changes in development of the frontal part of the brain right here that Dr. Friedman talked about. And one of the interesting things that they've shown is that part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, the volume of that is lower with the earlier onset of smoking. You can see for kids that start smoking at age 12 versus kids who start smoking after the age of 17 or 18, the volume of that very important part of the brain is reduced. Okay, we're going to stop. Okay, so you have these other figures in your setup. I'll stop there.